Hello and welcome back. This is the second part of a talk that we are doing between the City of London Police Museum and the Metropolitan Police Service Museum. So we've got Kim Biddulph, who's the Public Programmes Project Manager for the City of London Police Museum, Paul Bickley, who's the Curator of the Crime Museum with the Metropolitan Police. I'm Claire Smith. I'm the Historic Collection Curator with the Met Police. And today we're going to hear about the siege of Sidney Street. So really what happened next after Kim's great talk on the Houndsditch murders. This is really part two. And we've crossed the border. So we've moved from City of London Police territory across into Met Police territory. So Paul is going to pick up the narrative for us. Thanks, Paul.
Well, right, in the weeks that followed the horrendous Houndsditch murders, both the City of London Police and the Metropolitan Police were both actively involved in looking for those responsible. For although the murders took place on the City of London's ground, it became clear that the suspects lived in an area covered by the Met. Both forces worked together to bring them to justice. Right, to assist in this process, wanted posters like this one were published on the 22nd of December 1910. Some, like this one, were in English, but also in other languages because it was considered relevant, in the areas that we were looking for people. A lot of people in those areas didn't speak English, so there was no point in just having posters in English when the people you're looking for help didn't speak that language. This poster has a picture of George Garstein. He was the suspect who was killed at the scene by his colleagues. The picture was taken in the morgue and circulated to positively identify him and to identify his associates and where he'd been living and any other information we could glean about him. When this was achieved, we found ammunition and bomb-making equipment. The poster also identified 3 other suspects that the police wanted to question. One was named Fritz Svars, and you can see on the poster there's a detailed description of him. The second is the famous Peter the Painter. His description is also given. Both men were said to have links to 59 Grove Street, and I call it Grove Street, and I know some of the information that Kim had yesterday or last time was actually Grove Road. The documentation does seem to mention both. If I refer to it as Grove Street, that's just the information I have, but I understand it's also sometimes referred to as Grove Road. And this is where Gardstein's body was found. The third suspect was a woman in her late 20s. There's no picture, but again, they give a detailed description. This is a second poster. This is the one, it's in pre-revolutionary Russian. So I'm told. I don't read pre-revolutionary Russian, but I take it for granted, and that's what's written at the top.
We're not too disappointed in you, Paul, for not being able to read pre-revolutionary Russian.
Yeah, that would be quite a feat, wouldn't it? Yeah, we have a Yiddish one on display in the museum as well, because a lot of the people who lived in the East End, of course, had a Jewish background and spoke Yiddish.
Okay, so the big breakthrough in the investigation really came through on the 1st of January 1911. A man called Charles Perlman came forward to say that suspects Joseph Sokolov and Fritz Svars were now staying with Mrs. Betty Gertson in a flat in 100 Sidney Street. There was a lot of information coming in from many sources at this time, but this sounded the most promising. Betty Gertson had approached Perlman in an attempt to find somewhere else for the suspects to hide, and they were due to move to Perlman's cousin's house, possibly in the middle of the night. Officers discreetly visited Sidney Street. They wanted to find out what the house looked like, how it was laid out. Number 100 was a 10-year-old house, so not too old, 4 stories, brick-built terraced house. And we commenced observations from the first floor of number 109, which is just across the road. Obviously, we want confirmation that the suspects actually live there. There's not malicious information or there's any other information we need. We don't want to raid a house or wait there all day only to find the information was wrong. The initial plan was to have lots of officers in the area, and then we're going to ambush the suspects en route to the new hideout, because that would seem to be the easiest and safest way to deal with the problem. However, Mrs. Gertson then told Perlman that there'd been a change of plan. Spars would go alone to the new address, and Joseph would only join him if he heard that Spars had arrived safely. At 12:30 a.m., that's the middle of the night, on the 3rd of January 1911, Superintendent Mulvaney and Detective Inspector Wensley of the Metropolitan Police met with Superintendents Stark and Ottaway of the City Police at Arbor Street Police Station. There, they briefed 200 police officers taken from both forces. Now, these officers were specially chosen, not because of any specialist skills, but for the fact that they were unmarried. It was felt there was going to be a fierce battle with lots of casualties, and this was probably true. These were armed and dangerous criminals that we're looking for. They've murdered 3 police officers, and they would have known that even if they were arrested alive, they were found guilty, convicted, they're going to be executed anyway. So they had no real reason to come quiet. But the plan then really was still to surround, contain, and negotiate. The officers, they armed themselves with whichever guns they could lay their hands on, and these included bulldog revolvers, shotguns, rifles, but these were then to prove no match to the weapons held by the anarchists. For a similar situation today, our officers are specially trained and they have access to the whole arsenal of specialist weapons. Inquiries, it was established there were 15 people living in 100 Sidney Street. That's 8 on the ground floor, 6 on the first floor, and Betty Gertson lived on the second floor. And this is where the suspects were believed to be hiding. It was a bitterly cold night. There was rain and sleet falling from the sky. The local residents were not at all happy when they were told to evacuate the houses. But the officers, they managed to get into the houses either side, just in case the suspects broke through the wall. We then had to try and get the innocent people out of a number 100 Sidney Street, so they didn't get any hurt in any incident that was to follow. This is Rebecca Fleishman. She appears to be a real hero, the landlady of 100 Sidney Street. She was very helpful in the evacuation. She discreetly contacted the other residents and persuaded them to leave. The only problem became 90-year-old Mr. Clements. He eventually had to be carried out of the premises. He didn't want to go, and he did not go quietly. This wouldn't have assisted the police operation.
I do love the fact that for all the planning that you've then got to deal with a 90-year-old Mr. Clements who's just not happy about having to go out in the cold.
Well, yeah, who's going to want to go out at the middle of the night? It's raining. You're 90 years old. You're not going to want to go out in the streets just because the police want to go and arrest someone.
Yeah.
And it's amazing they managed to evacuate the whole house with the 2 suspects in one of the rooms of the house, left not knowing what was going on.
It's all a bit strange, yeah. I mean, I was saying not knowing what's going on. I think they probably did know, because how could they not know with the noise that Mr. Clements was making? Obviously, everyone else is out of the flat. But now we need to get Mrs. Gertson out, and she's on the second floor. She's with the suspects, and so without any thought for her own safety, Mrs. Fleishman went up to the second floor and she knocked on the door of the flat. Her plan was to ask Betty to come quickly as her husband needed help. But when she knocked on the door, Mrs. Gertson didn't appear from her room. She came from a storeroom on the same floor. All the same, she did go with Mrs. Fleishman, and once they reached the ground floor, she was quickly ushered out of the building. When she was questioned by the police, Betty told them the 2 men, Fritz Vars and Joseph Sokoloff, were in the flat, but this was against her will, which is why she was staying in the other room. So we've now got everyone out of the house that we need out of the house, the neighbouring houses evacuated as much as we can. We now consider the options. Should we rush the building, overpower them, or should we wait? The stairs leading to the second floor were very narrow and there was a bend at the top, and it was clear that one man with a machine pistol could easily hold an army at bay. So the decision was made to wait until daylight, when we could talk the suspects out without anyone getting hurt. So the house was contained by hundreds of officers from both forces. But in 1910, we didn't have radios, so communication was very difficult. Good communication is something we take for granted today, and would have made this whole process a lot easier. I mean, if you tried to do a similar thing today, officers would find it very difficult. We do rely so much on the radios, the great communication we have today.
Of course, at this point, the police are still using whistles on the beats to signal to each other, which, of course, you can't do if you're trying to sort of guard a house and you don't want everybody to know what's going on.
Yeah, and if you're at the front of a house and you hear gunfire from the back, you're not going to know if it's your colleagues firing, suspects firing. It's going to be very confusing all round. To get people to move into different positions, it's going to be word of mouth passing it on rather than the way we'll do it today. So they waited for hours, and at 7:30 in the morning, Inspector Wensley and a selection of hand-picked officers were positioned in an alleyway opposite the house. They decided now was a good time to make contact with the suspects. And when knocking on the door didn't work, they decided to throw pebbles up at the second floor window to get their attention. In response, they received rapid gunfire from automatic weapons, and several officers had lucky escapes. One bullet went through the coat sleeve of Inspector Collinson. He's a City of London officer. Another bullet went through the rim of Inspector Hallam's hat. He was also a City of London officer. This officer, Sergeant Benjamin Leeson, was not so lucky. He was hit in the chest and the foot and had to be dragged back into an alley. His colleague. Leeson, he was going to die. He then said to Mr. Wensley, "Mr. Wensley, I'm dying. They've shot me through the heart. Give my love to the children and bury me in Putney." I don't really know the significance of Putney because I can't imagine too many East London officers who live in West London. But Putney must have some significance to his family.
It's quite poetic, bury me in Putney.
Yeah, very poetic. I'm sure it had a lot more meaning than just the poetry. So it's clear then he's been shot. He needs medical attention, but the officers, they're trapped in Sidney Street. If they went out into the main street there, they're going to be shot. A brave young man called Lewis Levy, he was in the yard with them. He climbed out of the rear of the premises and across the roofs and ran to a doctor's house to get assistance. As he went across the roof, he would have been in the sight and range of the anarchists, so he could have been shot himself. While he was away, Inspector Wensley also climbed on the roof and managed to organise a stretcher in case it was needed. Levy then returned with Dr. Johnson. They had to come back by the same route. This is climbing across the roof. And it didn't take long. After a quick examination of Leeson, the doctor said he had to be taken to hospital immediately. So we've now got a real problem. The only way out for Leeson is to be carried out across the roof. They positioned a ladder up against the wall, and Wensley personally assisted lifting Leeson. And Leeson was not a slightly built man. He was a thick-set man. It took a lot of lifting. He was lifted across the roof. But Lewis Levy again got involved in this. He assisted, as did another member of the public, a young man called Frank Gascoigne. And as they moved across the roof, the anarchists saw what was going on, so they started firing. This is a little map of Sidney Street. You can see, hopefully, the arrow there with my cursor. That's where the anarchists are, the suspects are. These buildings are 4-storey, and you can see to the right of that with police marksmen in this building. And on this side of the road, these are lower level buildings, only 2-storey, and the alleyways and the roofs are around here. So they had a good vantage point firing down onto the roof. So as they moved across the roof, the anarchists saw what was going on. They started firing at them. Leeson and his helpers were trapped on the roof for about 10 minutes. And then Leeson realised that he had to do something before someone else was shot. So he managed to roll off the roof and then was helped down to safety in the brewery yard and then rushed to hospital. Inspector Wensley, he remained trapped on the roof for a further 20 minutes. He was lying in a gutter full of cold water with sleet and rain coming down all around him, but the gunmen were also firing at him. So if he moved, he again would have been killed. Eventually, the gunmen were distracted and he managed to scramble to safety. News travelled fast in the East End, and as the word spread about the siege, a large crowd gathered. And you can see a picture of the crowd here. Look at those people coming to see what's going on. This is an armed operation. It looks like a football match or a rugby match. So this is one more problem for the police to deal with. So more officers had to be drafted in, and this took the number deployed to over 500, including the mounted branch. So Assistant Commissioner Sir Frederick Roadhouse, he was the senior Met officer involved in this operation, and he decided the police needed military assistance because their single-shot weapons were no match for the weapons carried by the suspects. Now, getting military assistance was not going to be a decision he took lightly, because since 1829, the Met had prided itself on policing by consent and not being seen as part of the military. The request had to go through the Home Secretary. At that time was Winston Churchill. He authorised it, but he decided he should go to the scene himself. Probably the only Home Secretary to ever take charge of an armed siege. The closest available troops were the Scots Guards, who were stationed a short distance away at the Tower of London. And by 10:45, 21 marksmen from the Scots Guard arrived and took up position around the plot, including some lying in the middle of the road with their guns pointed at the direction of the house, as you can see in this image. The photographer, strangely, must be positioned in the middle of the gunfight. This is a really strange picture for me. When you think about what you're looking at, the photographer is in front of the soldiers who are facing the gunmen. So he must have his back to the 100 Sidney siege. And if the gunfire starts, he's likely to get shot by the soldiers or the terrorists. If you look beyond where the police officers are standing on the balconies behind, you can see many people there looking at what's going on. And there are reports that householders were charging 10 shillings a time for the privilege of using the balcony to get a good view of the siege. Another image of a very similar thing, but this one's a bit more appropriate. You can see the photographer this time is behind the soldiers. But if you look up to the windows above the shops, people still looking out the window to see what's going on. They would have been in range and sight of the anarchists. So again, in danger of being shot.
Paul, did you say that what they're lying on, the soldiers, it's newspaper hoardings? That,
yeah, I'm going to come to that one. I'm going to come to that one, Kev.
Oh, I find that, I'm fascinated by that one.
So this is a more slightly posed shot. You can see the officers kneeling, and you're quite right. In today's day, I'm sure the military have very special blankets designed to dry. As I said earlier, it's been raining, there's sleet coming down, but these officers, they weren't given specialist equipment. So they seized some newspaper stands, and you can see they're kneeling on and lying on to keep their bodies off of the wet floor. As I say, today I'm sure they've got much better equipment.
It's just that sort of wonderful inventiveness and adaptation that, you know, you need to be protected. So news hoardings, because they would have been on every corner.
Yeah, they did a great job. Yeah, thinking on their feet.
Yeah.
Churchill arrived at the scene at midday. Now, his presence would have added to the problems facing senior officers. Probably the last thing they needed was the Home Secretary turn up at scene. Showing no fear for his own safety, he stood with other officers at the junction less than 100 metres from the address. And much is made of Churchill attending the scene, but he was not the only senior manager there. Also there was Assistant Commissioner Roadhouse, Assistant Commissioner McNaughton, also Assistant Commissioner Bruce. These are all from the Metropolitan Police. So William Knott Bower, the Commissioner of the City of London Police. From the military, we have Major General Codrington, and even Ernie Blackwell, an Under Secretary of the Home Office, felt it is his duty to be there. Now, was this conviction of duty or a strong sense of curiosity? You can see them there, say 100 metres away, shots firing all over the place. There's a fair chance that Churchill could have been shot.
In I think it was 2008, the Daily Mail did a piece on Sidney Street and claimed that a bullet had gone through Churchill's hat in a kind of, you know, how close we came to losing this Great Britain. And Churchill himself did admit that it was curiosity as much as duty that made him go. But then that when he got there, he realised what he couldn't then do was turn around to get back in his car and drive away, because you couldn't be seen to leave obviously such a dramatic and dangerous scene. So yeah, it's I also find it really interesting because we're not really used to seeing a young Churchill. We're so used to seeing him as he was Second World War era, sort of the older statesman, that I think a lot of people are fascinated to see this sort of quite young looking man in amongst this danger.
Yeah, it tells you, you know, he was involved in the government for such a long time. I think he also says, you know, when he says he couldn't get in his car and drive away, it was also because everything was extremely interesting, apparently. So, yeah.
Fortunately for him, it didn't last too long, was it?
Yeah.
He was lucky, wasn't he, really? He got there at 12. It was all over by 2. But had it been some of the modern day sieges that last for 8 days, he may have changed his mind. So he's there, he's going to take charge, he's the Home Secretary, and he assessed the situation and he decided they needed even greater firepower, so he called for a field gun. A Maxim field gun arrived at scene at 1:30. However, before it could be deployed, smoke could be seen coming from the window of number 100. This is another picture I love. The picture shows the building alight from the upper windows. There's obviously no police officers or fire brigade around at this stage, but clearly our intrepid photographer has managed to get a great shot. He must have got into the house directly opposite. And looking at the angle of the picture, I think he must be in the building rather than on the street there, which would have been even more dangerous. So no one really knows what caused the fire. It could have been caused by a stray bullet, much debate about this, or it could have been set deliberately, as some people say, as by the suspects as an attempt to make a diversion so they could escape. But as the fire took hold, the shooting slowed down. The fire brigade were called and they were on standby, but clearly it's not safe for them to approach a building where shots are being fired. Again, today's date, you're not going to let the fire brigade go into a building where there's people firing out the windows.
Apparently he was willing to do it, but apparently he was willing to do it, but Churchill himself said in his report at the committee afterwards that he did use his authority as Home Secretary to tell the fire brigade officer that the house was to be allowed to burn down. Yeah,
well, if today's date, you're not going to let fire brigade do. The fire brigade wouldn't want to. I can't imagine any risk assessment where they're going to go into a building where there's people firing bullets at them.
No.
It would have been suicide. The last shot was fired at 2:10 p.m. and by this time, a soldier, another police officer, and 4 members of the public had been shot because they're all within range of the bullets. Fortunately, none of them were seriously injured. At this point, the roof crashed in and the first floor collapsed. Detectives moved forward, as you can see from this picture, to check the house. This was before the fire brigade were allowed to move forward, had to make sure it's safe for the fire brigade. A newspaper report says that it was Inspector McCarthy who kicked open the door and was the first to step inside. His hand was on his revolver, but apparently he kept it concealed in his pocket. Now, I know if I was in his position, my gun would definitely be in my hand pointing towards any danger, because action is much quicker than reaction. By the time he got his gun out of his pocket, he'd have probably been shot. So not quite sure where he kept it in his pocket, but it's in the press, it must be true. So fire brigade finally allowed to go forward and do their stuff. This shows the scene of the fire brigade putting out the fire, police and soldiers looking on. This one shows from a slightly different angle. And sadly, as the fire brigade were putting out the fire and inspected the building, a wall collapsed, injuring 5 of the firemen and killing senior fire officer Charles Pearson. A search of the building later discovered 2 bodies. One later identified as Joseph Sokoloff. He was found on the first floor being shot. The other was on the ground floor and was identified as Fritz Vars. He'd been overcome by smoke. This was the first siege recorded on film, and if you do search the internet, you can actually see some of the newsreel. It's fantastic to see Churchill, fire brigade at work, the soldiers. There's some really interesting footage.
And apparently it was shown in a theatre in London that night. So it could be argued it's the first almost sort of rolling news, because it's happened in the afternoon and in the evening you can go and watch it. It's that quick.
Looking at the crowds at the scene, I'm guessing the cinemas were a bit of a sellout just to see the news features then, looking at that one. The next image I've got there is some soldiers standing around with the famous Maxim gun at the end of the siege. As I mentioned earlier, it was brought to the scene but not required. Looking at it, I'm not quite sure how they could have got in a position to use that unless the terrorist actually came out of the premises and were on the street, because it looks like you need to be facing the house to actually use it, which would have put yourself in a very vulnerable position. Right, my next image, this sketch is a man known as Superintendent Mulvaney. And he appeared at the inquest into the deaths of Fritz Vars and Joseph Sokoloff on the 6th of January 1911. In the image, he can be seen holding one of the 2 Mauser pistols recovered from inside 100 Sidney Street. The sketch was drawn by a man called William Hartley. Now, William Hartley was one of the top court artists at the time, and this image would have appeared in the newspapers. If you look closely at the picture, Hartley incorrectly refers to the superintendent as Detective Inspector Mulvaney, which I'm sure wouldn't have impressed the superintendent at that time. Now, this is a picture of the actual weapon. The Mauser has a range of about 200 meters and is capable of automatic fire, much better than the single shot weapons being carried by the officers. It would have had a wooden handle, and I can only assume that was burnt off in the fire. And the thing that appears to be a metal frame attached to the handle, this would have been a stop. They put it against your shoulder to make the shooting more accurate, because it's a rapid firing weapon that would want to fly all over the place. Again, this would have had a wooden covering that I assume was burnt off in the fire. So moving on from the siege, we go on to the trial. Now, the trial of the surviving suspect starts on the 1st of May 1911 before a man called Judge William Grantham at the Old Bailey, and it lasted for 11 days. Ballistics showed that the murder weapon was a Drey's pistol of the type found in Gardstein's bed. A man called Sergeant Bryant identified Gardstein as being the person who shot Sergeant Bentley. The judge himself even said he believed Gardstein had done the shooting, obviously making him the prime suspect. Sokolov and Sars, who died in the siege, were considered also to be main players, so this made it a very difficult trial for the prosecution, because it became easy for the remaining suspects to blame everything on those who were dead or the likes of Peter the Painter, who were on the run.
Yeah, and at this point, let me just hold my hands up and say I got something wrong in the first video about the pistol found at Grove Road or Grove Street, which was Drey's pistol and not the Mauser. So but 2 Mausers were found at Sidney Street, weren't they, Paul?
2 found at Sidney Street, and there was a lot of Mauser
and a Browning.
ammunition.
Yeah.
And a lot of Mauser ammunition found at Grove Street, Grove Road. So it's easy to have that problem.
Yeah, it was. I got confused by the ammunition, I think, when I was going through all of the primary sources. It's sometimes a bit confusing.
Quite strange, got lots of Mauser ammunition, but not a Mauser. So yeah, the Mauser was probably there at some stage.
And the ballistics report was that the Dreys was what killed all of the officers, whereas there was a Mauser bullet in Constable Choate's leg, but not that didn't kill him. And Gardstein was killed by a bullet from a Browning pistol, which was found at 100 Sidney Street as well. So it's important to get these details right, though, isn't it? Because that's the whole point of the trial.
Definitely. It shows that Gardstein can't have had the Browning if he's shot with the Browning. So yeah, he must have had the Drey's pistol. So we've arrested all these other suspects and they're put on trial. Hartley attends this trial as well and does his sketches. The man in this picture is a man called John Rosson, who you mentioned earlier. The main evidence against him appears to be he was identified by a witness who said he saw him leaving the scene, and that Rosson apparently knew too much about the crime not to have been involved. But the defence counsel successfully argued that Rosson looked very, very similar to Fritz Fars, who died in the siege. So it was just clearly a case of mistaken identity. So the case against Rosson was dismissed and he was set free. Also in this sketch is a lady called Nina Vasileva. I apologise if I got that pronunciation wrong, but that's how I pronounce the way it's spelled. She was arrested because her prints were found at the crime scene. She had clear links to the gang, as she was either Gardstein's girlfriend or girlfriend of one of the others. It was not clear whose girlfriend she was. She had clothing with Gardstein's blood on it. She'd been identified by the witness, Levy, leaving the scene. Witnesses also identified her as having lived at 11 Exchange buildings just prior to the murder. So for me, quite a lot of evidence there. And this was confirmed by fingerprints found in the flat, again, as Kim mentioned earlier. So she was found guilty and sentenced to 2 years in prison. However, her sentence was overturned on appeal, as it was ruled that the jury had been misdirected by the judge. It was felt by the appeal court that he should have invited the jury to consider whether Nina had been living at number 11 Exchange buildings and totally unaware that the others there were actually breaking into number 9. And because they weren't invited to do that, her sentence was overturned. We have another sketch of a suspect. This is another Hartley sketch. This is one of the remaining suspects. It would be nice to know which one, but rather than naming him, as he normally does, you see in the bottom right-hand corner of this image, all Hartley does is refer to him as a murderer. Now, it's either Jacob Peters or Zuka Duboff. And Kim, I don't know if you had a chance to look at the images. I've looked at the mugshots, but all the images we get are from the face, from the front.
Yeah.
So it's very difficult to say for any real certainty which one it is.
It is. I haven't been able to work it out, or even if it's another one of John Rosen. Or, and it's interesting that he just that Hartley just put a murderer on there when the murder charges were dropped almost immediately when the trial started because of the lack of evidence that any of them had been involved. So. Whether or not he did it immediately, just before that ruling, or whether he just decided that these people were indeed murderers.
Yeah, maybe that was his fault. Yeah, as you say, I mean, evidence against Biddulph and Jacob Peters was apparently they had been seen by this witness, Isaac Levy, leaving the scene, and the judge decided this wasn't sufficient for a guilty verdict. Very difficult in 1911 to get too much more corroboration. Today we'd look for CCTV cameras, cell site analysis, and a whole wealth of forensic evidence. 1911?
Yeah.
What else to go with? So it would have been very difficult. If you haven't got the witnesses there, I'm not sure what other corroboration they were looking for.
No, because it was all hinges on Isaac Levy's testimony, and I think it was shown in court that it was different to the statement that he made to the police, and the fact that he identifies these two men, Jurka Dubov and Jacob Peters, was then thrown out of court again. But he also said that he saw Nina Vasileva, or Vasileva as I've been calling her, come, and that were coming past him, as I mentioned yesterday, and that was allowed. So it seems again a bit of a strange ruling, I think, by the judge to say that part of his testimony seems to be not right, but the other part's fine. Surely, if part of it's not right, you would kind of throw it all out. So yeah,
I think he's probably looking for a little bit of corroboration, whereas in Nina's case there was a fair bit of corroboration with the fingerprints, other witnesses.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah.
On this one, it just relied on Isaac alone saying this is the man I saw. Which, if that's all you had, I think actually the judge was very disrespectful, saying maybe he should have done more, should have followed them, should have done this. These are men with guns in their hands. I'm not sure many people would have followed them to their hideout. The next image I have is a special memorandum circulated to police officers with pictures of Peter the painter. He looks very suave. You may think he's a portrait painter, but my understanding he paints houses. I'm not sure he turned up dressed in his suit and tie to paint houses, but he's the one most people remember. I think it's mainly because his name is much easier to say than Vasileva and Sokolov and the likes. In the months that followed, like always, there were many apparent sightings of him all around the world, but he was never arrested. But from what I can see, there was no more evidence against him than those already acquitted. So if he'd been arrested, brought back to this country, chances are he would have been acquitted as well. Following the siege, there was many newspaper reports and calls for an inquiry and suggestions from lots of people wise after the event, how things could have been done differently. But I'm guessing it's no different from today. If we have a similar incident, there's always calls for an inquiry, and we'll have a full debrief to see how things could have been done better. Lewis Levy.
One of the debates was, sorry, Paul, one of the debates particularly was, let's arm the police, which of course happens quite a lot, but is one of the fundamentals of British policing, isn't it? That it's a civilian force and not armed, apart from a small minority. So but it's interesting that they were having the same
argument, all those years ago. There's recognition of the bravery of the members of the public. Lewis Levy, Frank Gascoigne, Dr. Nelson Johnson, all received awards from the Carnegie Heroes Trust for putting their lives in danger to help the police. Levy got £10, Gascoigne got £10, and the doctor got a full £25 for risking their lives to help the police. So it's nice to see they got recognised.
And there was a change in terms of weaponry, though, after this for the police, wasn't there? There was a feeling that the modern weaponry was needed because the police had been so outgunned by this gang.
Oh yeah, I mean, I think as Kim says, I mean, every time we have an incident, I mean, you see it throughout history. I mean, even going to the other sad case, we had the Foxtrot 1-1 case. Again, recognised there, even by 1966, we didn't have the right guns, the right training. So again, it was developed, and I'm sure if we had a similar incident today, we do review the weapons carried and the training that's carried out. So yeah, even back in 1911, very similar process.
Yeah, there were some trials to take on new weapons the following year, and it was quite funny. I just came across a letter from a gun merchant in Bond Street called Westley and Co. that Superintendent Ottaway had written to ask if they could trace the Mauser from the the registration number, and they found that it had probably been sold in Antwerp. And then they enclosed an advert for Mauser into the letter and said, "We'll sell you this at this price if you want any guns."
That's true businessman.
Yeah, never miss a marketing opportunity.
Yeah.
Yeah, and would have done well to take up his offer, really. Just talking about what happened to the people after the siege. The man in the picture at that time was Inspector Frederick Porter Wensley. He became one of the Met's finest detectives, and he received, as I put there, the KPM, the OBE, and he became known as one of the Big Four. Now, these were 4 superintendents who were partly responsible for Scotland Yard getting its worldwide reputation for their detective ability. In 1924, he became the chief constable of the CID in the Met, and one of his big claims to fame, he set up the world-famous flying squad. In case I didn't mention earlier, I was on the flying squad.
Paul, were you on the flying squad?
We do like to talk about the world-famous flying squad. Benjamin Leeson, though he was shot in the chest and in the foot, he recovered from his injuries, but he was never fit enough to go back working in policing, so he decided to visit Australia. He later wrote a book about his life, and in the book he explained that part of his job as a police officer was to get to know the local criminals, where they lived, who they associated with. And he said he knew Peter the Painter by sight, and they both drank in the King's Head public house in Grove Street. So it was a great surprise to him when he was travelling around Australia that he ended up in the same carriage as Peter the Painter. But he says the journey passed without incident and with very little being said. Although he says he knows it's a very weird coincidence that he should end up in the same train carriage in Australia.
Well, I have an interesting Australia Peter the Painter fact.
Okay.
The drama series Miss Fisher's Murder Mysteries, in the 4th episode of series 1, Miss Fisher is investigating some Latvian anarchists and goes to a club and is introduced to Peter the Painter, because he's introduced as he was involved in that Sidney Street business. And the author, Kerry Greenwood, said that when she was researching this story, a dock worker from Melbourne said to her, "Oh, well, you know, Peter the Painter came here and lived in Australia." So we have these two kind of completely uncorroborated, I should say, sort of links to to Peter going to Australia. But yes, it's interesting that he makes his a TV appearance in quite a glamorous 1920s series of murder mysteries, and he is portrayed as rather a romantic, sort of dangerous figure.
Of course, he was, because he was in the 1960s film as well, wasn't he?
Yes.
And it was said that he managed to escape from 100 Sidney Street without being detected. When, in all actuality, he wasn't there and wasn't really involved in the entire thing. He lived in the back room where with George Gardstein, I think, at 44 Gold Street, and he was sometimes included in some of their evenings where they would play cards or they would whatever and have talk and have some music, but apparently was very reserved, according to some of the statements made by Nina Vasilova and some of the others, and wasn't really part of the group. So it's just, I think, because of that photo that you showed, Paul, about how suave and good looking he was, and because he was so kind of mysterious, that he has become this cult figure in a way. And in the archives, which are at the London Metropolitan Archives, we don't actually hold them ourselves at the City of London Police Museum. There are letters sent by people all over the world who have seen Peter the Painter in Boston and, you know, in Marseille and in Melbourne, and sent them sometimes to the City of London Police and sometimes via Winston Churchill. I sent them straight to him, and then he's passed them on to Notbauer. So yeah, it was.
We've got quite a few of those as well.
Have you?
I've got loads of reports from around the world and around this country and around London of definite sightings of Peter the Painter, which again, most of it is people trying to be helpful. He fits the description. They will let us know. It's just, I don't think it's malicious. It's just
no, not malicious
to be helpful.
at all. But then eventually you get letters sent out by not Bauer, saying, please don't look for him, to various police forces around the world, to say, you know, we're not actually looking for him. We don't think he's got anything to do with it. But that doesn't seem to have reached public consciousness. The main thing is that he was the one that got away.
It's true. He definitely is in public consciousness kind of as a romantic bad boy figure.
Yeah.
He appears, well, this maybe is what happened to him. He appears in the 2012 TV drama Titanic. He's a passenger on the Titanic who he has quite a busy time even before they hit the iceberg. He has a romance. He murders another passenger. He leads an uprising of the third-class passengers. I mean, he does make the most of his time at sea, but he is obviously this figure that people feel is sort of the anarchist, the danger, that they can pin things on him. And he appears in a series of novels, Kim Newman's Anno Dracula, which the idea is that Dracula doesn't get dispatched at the end of the novel, but he goes on and he marries Queen Victoria. But that eventually there's a conspiracy to bring him down, and one of the conspirators is Peter the Painter. And interestingly, in the novel, it's a bit of a mashup of literature and history. Peter's the only fictional, non-fictional character. So everybody else in this group is fictional, and Peter's the only real one. So he really, really beds himself into that sort of cultural unconsciousness in terms of anarchy and rebellion.
Yes, it's amazing. And I think that, I mean, clearly Nina was involved in some way. She couldn't have been there without knowing what was going on. And she kept on talking about other people who were involved, someone called Marx and so on. But her statements changed so often, I think, that they just...
I think a few of them did, didn't they? Especially towards the end, when they could see there was a way out, so they could twist the stories to blame, let's say, the people who were dead or not there. So
yeah. But I have a feeling, it's only a gut feeling, that actually the one who was in charge was the one who supplied the oxygen cylinder, who was a well-known Italian anarchist, Enrico Malatesta. And that hasn't really been hugely explored, but I think that sounds very dodgy, because his statements changed about why and when he supplied the oxygen to the gang, and who it was that he supplied it to, and how he knew George Gardstein and stuff like that. So, but that was never really explored. But yeah, it's just such an interesting case, and it does have slightly comical things going on with it with the Sidney Street and in the aftermath. But obviously we've got to remember that lots of people lost their lives during these events, starting with the 3 police officers. So I would like to just leave this memorial on screen for a little while to remember Sergeant Bentley, Sergeant Tucker, and Constable Choate.
It's such a well-known and well-remembered event, the Siege of Sidney Street, and I think, Kim, you were saying that people tend to forget the origins of this. That it's the hand-stitched murders. It's these 3 police officers losing their lives, that other police officers being injured and having their lives changed. And I think because of the film and this Winston Churchill, there's so much the public can hang on to that they maybe forget what actually is the start of the narrative and the tragedy of it.
Yeah, you're right. And the fire officer who died, he'd suffered from his injuries for several months after being crushed by the wall, I believe. So yeah, and there were a couple of city police officers who were discharged because they were injured in so Sergeant Woodhams and Sergeant Bryant as well. So yeah, it did affect many lives.
Yeah. And that's what you have to remember more than the glamorization of people like Peter the Painter, as quite often happens with these cases. It's the criminal can get glamorized, but you have to remember the officers losing their lives and being injured.
Yeah, but also that Peter the Painter probably wasn't even a criminal. He's been unfairly tarnished in many ways. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's interesting to think about the history that gets sort of spun and built upon, but yes, to be able to go back to the facts of these officers losing their lives, and the terror that must have been on the streets of East London, as this was, this was opposite where people were living. This was next door to where people were living. It must have been absolutely terrifying.
You would have thought so, but look in some of the images and some of the Pathé News shots, they're there as if they're at a concert or a football match.
They do seem to be quite keen to get a glimpse.
Yeah. Well, I know that one of the things that I help with is family history inquiries, and we get an awful lot of, we think great granddad was at Sidney Street and stood next to Churchill. And I think after today and hearing you guys speak, it's very possible. There were hundreds of officers there. Unfortunately, we'll never know exactly who stood next to Churchill, but I think I'm going to start advising people to watch this video and to learn more about Houndsditch murders and Sidney Street, because I certainly feel like I know more about the cases now and more about why we need to think through everything from the crime to the police officers to the trials, because there's so much going on in each section of this narrative.
I certainly have learned a lot from Paul's knowledge of the Sidney Street side of things as well. It's interesting to see the city and the Met working together, and who got what after, who got what evidence, who's ended up with different reports and things like that as well. So bringing them together has been really useful.
Well, thank you for inviting us.
Yeah. It was interesting hearing the early stages and hearing about the officers and the inquiries that took place. It's nice that, as they did, that we could work together on this.
And hopefully we can do it again. So it would be lovely if we can keep chatting in this way.
Definitely.
Well, thank you both. This has been really fascinating, and I'm sure that everybody's going to enjoy it. And we're very happy to take questions, so that if anybody wants to contact us to learn more about Houndsditch murders or Sidney Street or the history of the City of London and the Met Police, please do get in touch. Thanks very much.